The crazy mountains of Montana do not care about your experience or your gear. They are a jagged scar on the landscape that locals whisper about with a certain kind of hollowed-out respect. They call them the Crazies for a reason. And it has nothing to do with the steepness of the slopes or the unpredictability of the weather. It is the way the air feels like it is vibrating with a frequency that humans were never meant to hear. Aaron Hedges was a man who knew these woods as well as he knew the lines on his own palms. He was 38 years old, a seasoned hunter, and a man who understood the brutal mathematics of survival in the high country. But on that morning in September of 2014, the mountains decided that his experience was an insult they could no longer tolerate. Aaron stood at the trailhead, the weight of his pack, a familiar comfort against his spine. The morning air was crisp, tasting of pine needles and the coming winter. Yet, there was a metallic tang in the back of his throat that he could not explain. He adjusted his rifle, the cold steel biting through his gloves. His friends were beside him, laughing and checking their maps, oblivious to the way the shadows of the pines seemed to stretch just a little too far toward them. They were heading into the heart of the range, a place where the cell service dies and the modern world becomes a distant, fading dream. Aaron took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the thin mountain oxygen, unaware that this would be the last time his lungs would ever feel truly full. By the afternoon of September 7th, the group reached a point where their paths needed to diverge. Aaron was going to head toward a supply cache they had set up previously. A simple plan that should have taken him only a few hours of steady hiking. He waved a hand at his companions, a casual gesture that would haunt their sleep for the rest of their lives. As he stepped away from the group, the sound of their voices seemed to be swallowed by the earth with terrifying speed. He looked back once, but the trees had already closed in around him like a green curtain being pulled shut by invisible hands. He was alone now, and the mountain was finally ready to speak to him in its true voice. The wind began to howl, but it was not the sound of moving air. It was a rhythmic, pulsing moan that seemed to come from deep within the granite beneath his boots. Aaron checked his compass, but the needle was dancing a frantic, jagged jig that made no sense. He shook it, thinking the cold had seized the mechanism. But the glass was warm to the touch, unnaturally warm. The light was beginning to fail, turning the forest into a monochromatic nightmare of grey bark and black needles. He pushed forward, his heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The cache should have been right there, marked by a specific outcropping of rock that looked like a jagged tooth. But the rock was gone. The darkness did not fall so much as it erupted from the ground. Aaron realized with a sickening jolt that he was no longer walking on the trail. He remembered the trees here were twisted into agonizing shapes, their limbs reaching out like the fingers of a drowning man. He reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the plastic casing in the freezing dark. The static that greeted him was not the white noise of an empty channel. It was a sequence of low, guttural clicks that sounded like a language being spoken underwater. He managed to get a signal through to his friends, his voice steady but thin. He told them he had missed the cache and was going to hunker down for the night. A tactical decision that should have kept him safe until the dawn. But the night in the Crazies is not a time of rest. It is a time of shifting. Aaron built a small fire, the orange flames flickering feebly against an oppressive, oily blackness that seemed to lean in toward the heat. He sat with his back against a cedar tree, his rifle across his knees, listening to the forest breathe. There were no owls hooting, no crickets chirping, only the sound of something heavy moving through the brush just beyond the circle of light. It did not move like an elk or a bear. It moved with a fluid, silent grace that defied the tangled undergrowth, as if it were not touching the ground at all. Every time he turned his head to catch a glimpse, the movement would stop, leaving only the ringing silence in his ears. When the sun finally rose on September 8th, it was a pale, sickly disk, obscured by a heavy, freezing mist. Aaron was gone from his campsite, but he had left behind something that made no sense. His fire had burned down to white ash, but the ground around it was scorched in a perfect, geometric circle. He began to move again, but his direction was no longer toward the cache or the trailhead. He was heading deeper into the high peaks, toward a ranch miles away. His tracks in the soft mud showed a strange gait, as if he were being pulled along rather than walking of his own volition. The distance he covered in those early morning hours was a physical impossibility for a man carrying a heavy pack in that terrain. The search parties were mobilized within 48 hours, a swarm of men and dogs descending upon the mountain like an army. But the Crazies had a way of hiding what they had taken. The professional trackers noted a total absence of wildlife in the area where Aaron had last been seen. No birds sang, and even the insects seemed to have vanished into the cracks of the earth. The dogs, usually eager and focused, began to whimper and tuck their tails between their legs. They refused to pick up the scent, instead staring into the thickets with wide, rolling eyes. One handler remarked that it felt as if they were searching inside a giant stone tomb that was still being built around them. Then came the first of the impossible discoveries. On a high, wind-swept ridge miles from his last known position, the searchers found Aaron's boots. They were not scattered or lost in a struggle. They were placed neatly side by side on a flat rock, pointing toward the peak of the mountain. There were no tracks leading to the boots and no tracks leading away from them. The leather was dry and polished, despite the heavy rains that had lashed the mountain only hours before. To walk barefoot in this terrain is a death sentence, the sharp shale and frozen mud tearing flesh to ribbons within minutes. Yet there was no blood on the rocks, only the boots, waiting like a grim monument to a man who had simply stepped out of his own life. The mystery of missing 411 is often found in the items left behind. A week after the boots were found, a searcher spotted something bright orange, snagged on a branch in a deep ravine. It was Aaron's vest, followed quickly by his thermal layers and his pack. They were found in an area that had been cleared by ground teams 3 separate times. It was as if the mountain had grown tired of holding onto these human trinkets and had simply spat them back out onto the forest floor. The clothes were not torn, and the buckles on the pack were still neatly fastened. Everything was there, except for the man who had been wearing them. The sheer scale of the distance Aaron had traveled defied every law of human endurance. Without boots, in a state of advanced hypothermia, he would have had to navigate vertical rock faces and dense, thorny thickets in total darkness. The experts shook their heads, whispering about spatial anomalies and the folding of the landscape. It was as if the mountain had contracted, bringing 2 points miles apart into sudden, violent contact, only to stretch back out once Aaron had crossed the threshold. He was a ghost, moving through a shifting maze of granite and pine. Driven by a logic that no sane mind could ever hope to comprehend, the search was eventually called off as the winter snows began to bury the Crazies in a thick, white shroud. For months, Aaron Hedges was nothing more than a name on a missing persons poster, a flickering memory in the minds of his grieving friends. But the mountains were not finished with him yet. They were merely waiting for the ice to melt so they could reveal the final act of the tragedy. In the spring, a local rancher was out checking his fences when he saw something white gleaming in the tall grass near a small creek. It was a skull, clean, bleached by the sun, and looking up at the sky with hollow, sightless sockets. Aaron's remains were found less than half a mile from a ranch house that had been occupied the entire time he was missing. He had died of exposure within sight of a place that could have saved him. Yet he never made it to the door. He was found near a source of water, another common thread in these disappearances. But he had not drank. His body was positioned in a way that suggested he had simply laid down and waited for the end to come. There was no evidence of animal predation, no teeth marks on the bones, no signs that the scavengers of the forest had even touched him. Even the vultures had given him a wide berth, as if his very essence had been tainted by whatever he had encountered in the high peaks. The autopsy could provide no answers, only more questions. His bones showed no signs of trauma, no breaks that would have incapacitated him. He had simply stopped living. The term used by some is paradoxical undressing. A finale, a desperate act of a freezing brain that perceives a sudden flash of intense heat. But that does not explain the boots on the ridge. It does not explain the clothes appearing in cleared areas. It does not explain how a man could travel so far, so fast, through a landscape that should have broken him in half within the first mile. The mountains had claimed him, peeled him of his humanity. and then discarded the shell when they were finished. This case bears a chilling resemblance to the disappearance of young Jared Atadero in the mountains of Colorado, where his clothing was found years later in a spot searchers had passed dozens of times. Both cases involve experienced individuals, or those under close supervision who seem to vanish into a pocket of reality that simply should not exist. The patterns are there for those who choose to see them. The proximity to water, the impossible travel, the silent dogs, and the return of items in impossible locations. These are not accidents. They are the results of an apex predator that does not hunt for meat, but for the very soul of the traveler. We like to think that we are the masters of the wild, that our technology and our maps make us safe from the old terrors of the earth. But the story of Aaron Hedges is a reminder that there are places where the maps are wrong, where the mountains have names that we have forgotten, and hungers that we can never satisfy. When you walk into the Crazies, you are walking into a cathedral of stone that was built long before man ever learned to walk upright. And sometimes, the cathedral chooses to keep a visitor forever. Look back at the tree line. But nothing was there. Nothing human. Anyway, the next time you find yourself on a lonely trail, as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, listen to the wind. If it sounds like a voice you almost recognize, or if the trees seem to shift when you turn your head, do not stop. Do not look for the cache that isn't there. And for the love of God, do not take off your boots. The mountain is watching. And it is always hungry. Missing 411 is not just a collection of stories. It is the sound of the wilderness laughing at our arrogance. Be careful out there, because the mountains are not just stone and dirt. They are alive, and they are waiting for you to take that one wrong step.